Thanks, Julie.
Good morning and welcome to AFP's EV reimbursement webinar. I'm delighted to introduce myself, Julie Summerall, AFP Director and your host for today, along with my colleagues James Pestle, also an AFP Director, Paul Hollick, our Chairman and our first presenter today, followed by Ashley Tate of NENA and Peter MacDonald of OMI. Before we begin the presentation, I'd like to just advise that we'll be recording the webinar to allow members to review content at a later stage. And of course, as always, the Q&A session will follow the presentations. Our first presentation, as I said, was from Paul Hollick, MD of TMC. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Julie, and welcome everybody. I'm attending today's webinar in a different guise. My day job, as a lot of people know, is the Managing Director of TMC, the Miles Consultancy. So I obviously give my time freely to the AFP. So I would like to talk for the next 15 minutes about EV reimbursements and how, as a fleet operator, it's best to navigate how to reimburse your employee for their domestic energy consumption and thinking about your EV reimbursement strategies. So just briefly on TMC, I know a lot of people know all about TMC, but TMC was founded in 2001. We're now in, believe it or not, 44 countries. We've got about 150,000 drivers on our system. We're partnering with an awful lot of people in this EV ecosystem because we believe that we can really help shape the UK in particular, but also European strategies and support fleet operators to reimburse their employees for any element of the EV journey. We do an awful lot on driver reimbursement of business trips for any vehicle, fuel EV card payment devices, including private usage control. We also sell EV fuel cards. And believe it or not, we're doing a lot more now on occupational road arrest, driving license checks, risk assessments and things like that. James, can you go to the next slide? Next slide. I'd just like to start with just a summary of the rules in the UK around reimbursement. I think it's important. So although there is AER at the moment, which a lot of you guys would probably be reimbursing your car drivers, electric car drivers on at the moment, the revenue rules are that you can actually pay AER or the employee can be paid at actual cost. Now that actual cost just needs to be defined by you. And when the revenue come in, it needs to be defendable and realistic and in light of what the actual employee has been out of pocket by. There is also rules in terms of benefit in kind on EV charging, aka the new equivalent of free fuel. So in summary, if the employer is paying for the energy provision directly, and it's a company asset, it's all non-bickable. But if the employee is claiming back personal miles, either from their home charge point or on the EV highway, that would be a taxable benefit for the personal element only. So just keep that in mind. VAT as well on EV charging. It's currently not allowable to claim back the employee's domestic energy consumption VAT, which is 5%, but it is allowable to claim back the business element only for the VAT costs on the EV highway or the office-based charging as well. So again, some requirements there on cars, obviously not on vans, to be able to start looking at the split between business and private miles. James, next slide, please. For FEVs, obviously it's a little bit easier. FEVs have been around in the marketplace for a number of years. So again, a lot of our customers are paying either HMRC AFRs, because of course it's got petrol, normally petrol, sometimes a diesel engine in it, or can be paid at actual cost. Obviously grey fleet can be paid at AMAP. Now, a word of warning, and I've always got my soapbox about this, on our TMC data, we've got thousands of FEVs on our database. The average FEV MPG at the moment is 37.5 miles to gallon, and equivalent diesel is 46.2. So still at the moment, if you're using FEVs, still please make sure that at least 60 or 70% of all of the trips and the journeys are done on the EV powertrain. If they're done on the ICE powertrain, they are still not good cars. Okay, and we're seeing that, and we're starting to see a lot of employees complain about even AFR not being appropriate for their reimbursement because they need to be paid more, not less. Yeah. Okay, next slide, please, James. So in terms of reimbursing on FEVs, and I thought I'd start with FEVs first. I think in reality, they're easy. We have a mixture of things that we see on the TMC system. One is obviously you remove the fuel card from the employee, and the employee claims AFR if they've got a FEV company car. It's straightforward and easy. Again, you can still use a fuel card and deduct all the fuel from payroll. And insert the AFRs, which we find easier. You could have a fuel card and deduct the private element, but it's actually easier for all the fuel card spend to be deducted and then reinsert the AFR rates based on the business trips that you're doing. On our systems as well, we do have some of our customers that are actually reimbursing the employee at AER rate for the first 25 or 30 miles, depending on the vehicle. And thereafter, then they have the ability to claim the AFR because they'll be on the petrol cycle. And then we have options in terms of if they've got no fuel card and do it at actual cost, the employee declares the EV usage at home, adds the EV highway trips and the fuel payments, and we can bundle that together to reimburse the employee at actual cost or deduct the employee for their private miles. And vice versa on the fuel card. If the fuel card is being deployed, employee declares their EV home usage, assuming the fuel card will also pay for all the EV highway payments, and then we can then do a deduction for the personal use of what they've paid out on the fuel card. And then, of course, as well, challenge us if we do have other options, because we quite happily set different options up for our customers as well. So FEVs, in my view, are quite easy, and I'd always probably encourage, if you've got a FEV and they're doing high business miles, continue to use a fuel card and actually deduct all the fuel from the employee and then reinsert the AFRs at the relevant AFR rate is the easiest method of reimbursement for FEVs, or AFR only if you're not inserting a fuel card. Okay, next slide, please, James. On TMC, we do have various options for reimbursing employees for their domestic energy consumption. The first one is AER. It's exactly the same in our world as AFR. A lot of employers are reimbursing their employees at AER at 4 pence per mile at the moment. And also for us, it's quite easy to add in any EV highway payments out of pocket and add all that together and then reimburse the employee at a blended AER rate as well. Next slide, please, James. Now, the issue with AER, as we're all aware, is 4p just doesn't cut it for a lot of vehicles. Now, in the old generation, your i3s, your Renault Zoes, as you can see from this chart, at 16 pence per kilowatt hour, with an adjustment factor of 15% for real world driving. As you can see on this chart, that cost of an i3 would be about 3.5 pence per mile to run. But the new gen of vehicles, your I-Paces, your XC40s, your Mercedes EQCs, they're a lot more expensive. So for a Volvo XC40, it's 5.8 pence. And obviously the employee being reimbursed at 4 pence would effectively be out of pocket. So in those examples, as a fleet operator, what do you do? What do you do? Okay, next slide, please, James. Now, the first thing you could do is start to look at, okay, what is their energy provider? So this is a Tesla Model 3. And as you can see, depending on the tariff that the employee is actually using at home, if they're using a British gas tariff at 20 pence per kilowatt hour, the cost per mile for this Tesla Model 3 would be 4.9p. If they're using EDF, it would be 3.6p. And if they're using Octopus, it would be 3.4p. But then if they then use an overnight tariffs on EDF, Octopus, or British Gas, it would be a lot lower. So 4p, if they were actually on a more or a better, more efficient energy cycle, energy provision, would actually probably be all right. But of course, there's that dilemma of fleet operators about how we would get involved with the employee's own energy supply. If you look at the public highway as well, cost per mile, it becomes really expensive. And of course, curbside charging, although we're not talking about it today, if the employee doesn't have their own home energy provision, it can be really expensive per mile for the employee to be charging their vehicles up. Next slide. Vans are even worse. So as you can see on this chart, again at the same adjustment factors of the Vauxhall Vivaro is 6.7p, the Renault Master ZE is 4.9p. So vans, if you're asking employees to charge vans up, which is essentially a business asset, it's going to be really challenging for them to be able to be reimbursed at 4p. So our advice is always for vans, do it at actual cost, which I'm sure Ashley and Peter will include in their presentations in a moment as well. Next slide, James. And then when you look at the Vivaro, again, in a similar way between the different suppliers of energy in the UK, you get a really mixed cost per mile. As you can see on the right-hand side of this chart, the left-hand side of the chart is the cost per kilowatt hour, and then the right-hand side is the cost per mile for each of those different types of energy providers. Okay, next slide. So because of that, we have different options at TMC. One is that, and about 16% of our customers are starting to use this now, is an actual cost basis, which we release the rates every quarter, and it's a cost for the cost per mile for each vehicle based on those slides that you've seen, and the employee gets reimbursed at that rate. This can be tempered by us inserting the employee's actual energy bill as well, or we can use 16 or 17 pence per kilowatt hour as a standard tariff based on the Office of National Statistics figures. And then the employee can be reimbursed at these rates in a really simple and easy way. And the employee can see, based on the chart that you've seen here in the middle of the screen, I've got a Renault Zoe or I've got a Smart 4.2, and it's X amount per mile that I will be claiming from on my TMC expense system. Okay, next slide, James. We've got a lot of customers now on cars and vans doing actual cost. Again, on the TMC systems, it's quite straightforward. The employee records their domestic energy usage every month. They tell us what their bill is and what their deal is. We can then consolidate all that data, including any out-of-pocket EV highway payments. We can also add in the office-based usage if we need to, and then the employee is then automatically reimbursed. If the clients are working with some of our charge point providers, we can rip the data directly out of the charge points. Or we are starting for vans, we are starting to rip some of the data out of the telematics data as well. And because we know the lat and long, we know where the employee lives, we know that it was a domestic energy charge, we know what the rate of reimbursement is. So therefore, then we can automatically auto reimburse the van drivers as well. It's quite straightforward. Okay. Next slide, James. And this on an actual cost basis, I know it could look a little bit complicated, but this is a energy statement that would go to an employee with their business and private split with the particular energy provisions between. In this example, we've got public EV highway with All-Star, we've got office with Pod Point EO, we've got the total amount of company incurred costs. We've got the smart charging costs at home. We've got any driver incurred out-of-pocket expense as well. We munge all that together, provide then the business and private split, and then the employee can see what they're going to be reimbursed or deducted with relative ease on a monthly basis. Really simple. Next slide, James. And then we've got a partnership with MENA. I'm sure Ash will mention this in a minute as well. Again, MENA are really great at what they do with the reimbursements of the employee's domestic energy. So when that tab has been picked up by the employer, we can again split the business and private element down and work out based on the office, based on the EV highway, based on the home, what's been reimbursed and what's been deducted, and therefore what the employee needs to be reimbursed or deducted on that monthly basis. Really straightforward and easy for us to do. Okay, next slide. By the way, I'm zipping through this a little bit. I know we're a little bit short on time for this webinar. If there are any questions, please contact me at paul.hollick@tmc.co.uk and I'll be pleased to help out. But as general tips for fleet managers, what we would try and do now is, and this is what I would recommend you guys think about, is splitting your data, looking at the employees with the driveways that can charge at home, and splitting the ones between need fleet, LCVs and perk, because each population will have different priorities. In my view, in our view, AER is great. It's simple. It is included in your whole life cost calculations. So remember, if you do move away from whole life cost calculations, you will need to, if you do move away from AER, you will need to think about your whole life cost calcs, because you'll be incurring a bit more cost. So you need to think that through. I think as fleet operators, it would be great if you can start to encourage your drivers to think about their energy costs and how they can optimize based on that EV that they've got on their driveway. Think about EV charge cards and fuel cards, and a lot of employees will need something, even if they're in distress, to be able to charge their vehicles up with. And as I mentioned earlier, just use me and TMC on this energy reimbursement program. We are specialists in the UK marketplace on this at the moment. So come to us or use bodies such as the AFP, of which I'm chairman, to be able to get some support. We've got on the AFP side, we've obviously got some great material as well on our website that you can download as well. So please get involved and also join up to the AFP. So that's it from me. Thanks for my 15 minutes. I'll hand back to Julie.
Thank you, Paul. Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself there. Okay, thanks ever so much. That was really great. I'd like to hand over to Ashley Tate now, who's the co-founder of MENA.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. Good morning, everyone. So as Julie says, I'm one of the co-founders and CEO at MENA. Brief bit of background. So MENA's been around now for almost 2 years, which is obviously very tiny in the compared to the likes of TMC, but we're part owned by All-Star, who most of you probably heard of. So we're doing some good joined up things with them, which I can tell you about a bit later on. So jump to the first slide, please. So I'm not going to repeat the stuff that Paul said around the facts, but I thought what I'll do is there's a few different scenarios, and I thought I'll talk around some experiences that we've come across when talking to real clients. So I guess the most obvious one that most customers jump to is, we're going electric, let's pay for PAER. Now, kind of Paul's already talked about a lot of the reasons why it's challenging. We've very recently been working with quite a large fleet that did quite an in-depth desktop exercise and said we're going to do 4 PAER, and that's exactly what they did. And 6 months later, they were in a world of pain where the drivers were, okay, there's a 50-50 split here. You've got drivers who've got massive tax benefits because they've gone EV, 1% benefit in kind. They're not so bothered that their fuel is costing them a bit more. The other end of the spectrum, especially when you get into van or commercial fleet world, they are not happy with 4p AER because it just doesn't cut it. But once you're in the world of EV and are reimbursing drivers at that rate, it's how do you get out of it? And I've seen real stories of fleets going, well, we'll pay you 5p and then 6p, and then we'll give you £50 a month just to sweeten it on top. And before they know it, there's no actual cost. It's all out of control. The drivers aren't happy, the fleet managers aren't happy, and your costs just spiral. So, I would say that if you're looking at AER as a way to do it, you don't just stick to the 4p AER rate. You've got to look at the type of vehicle, where people can charge, what tariffs they're on, and TMC have done a great job of trying to benchmark the AER based on the vehicles, which is far more accurate than just this blanket rate. Next slide. So 2 other options generally is where the employer calculates the actual cost of reimbursement and pays it through payroll. Obviously, then the onus is on the employer to then calculate that accurately, which can be great. If you've got a good setup with your charge point operators, or you're getting data from, say, telematics or another accurate source. Generally, the consumption of that charge is easy to get hold of. What can be quite challenging to get hold of is what physical kilowatt hour rate are all these drivers being paid out, or being charged on. So if you just take home, for instance, people switch tariffs regularly, sometimes without them knowing, so it's keeping on top of that. Something Paul said earlier is around, you can pay actual costs as long as it's defendable. and obviously the challenge there is if you don't really know and you can't prove what tariff a driver, certainly at home, is charging on, I can't imagine HMRC today would be too bothered, but, I think they might start to pick up on that if lots of drivers are getting overpaid. And the source of most tariff data that we've seen, certainly at home, is typically the charge point manufacturer. And they obtain it through a driver interface. So driver types, I'm on 22 pence a kilowatt. That's fine. Could be accurate when they set it up. Could drop to 18 pence, could increase to 25 pence. So you've got some concerns around there. There's a big thing about bill shock. And I'll talk about that as well on the next slide, because if you could just jump to the next slide, essentially this is they're almost one and the same, but this is where the employee calculates it and expenses it. So, really it's just who's putting the data together. Is it you as the employer, or is it the employee as the driver? But either way of doing these things, the key to making sure this is right is getting accurate data. The two bits of accurate data you need is where they charge, what's the kilowatt hours, and what's the tariff. But assuming you get all that right, the money flows through into payroll each month. And again, we've come across a real fleet that did this, and very successfully, for about 6 months to a year. But then what started to hit them was this concept of bill shock, where they're getting paid 50, 80 pounds a month in the payroll, all very nice. Energy supplier, the home energy supplier, hasn't read the meter. Nobody's given them a meter read. They've no idea that there's an electric vehicle sat in the drive. Direct debit's not changed. Suddenly an energy bill lands for 500, 600, £1,000. It might not even be the driver who's responsible for paying that bill. So they've just been pocketing this extra cost, which is very different from fuel. Fuel, if you're doing it on an expenses basis, typically you fill up at the pump, you pay for it there and then, you get reimbursed in payroll a few days later. So there is a challenge around, around the physical, how do you get the payment to the drivers? So next slide, we'll jump onto that. So this is what we do at MENA. And again, we don't do it on our own. There's lots of tie-ups with lots of partners. But ultimately the concept, what we do is we pay the energy suppliers directly. So the home energy suppliers. So that gives you as the fleet a single invoice. So if you're in a fuel card world today and you transition into EV, you can have a single bill, just like you do in the fuel card world, for all the charging that's done at home. Partnership that we've got with Allstar, we can do on the road as well, so we can tie all that together. We also have partnership with TMC. So if you've got the private business mileage split, we've got integrations, we feed the data both ways so that private miles can be deducted either at AER rate or actual cost. And because we're obviously capturing the home data and in some cases the on the road data, we can do true actual cost across all the charging platforms, not just one in isolation. And again, a key thing that we didn't really appreciate when we started MENA was how important this tariff validation piece would be. And understanding when a driver has either changed tariff or changed supplier without them needing to tell us has been quite important, because most people don't know, especially if you're not the bill payer, you probably don't know that your tariff changed. And a real example, in the last 10 days, hopefully there's not many more to go now. Sadly, we've had 4 energy suppliers, domestic energy suppliers, go out of business, so that's potentially 500,000 customers that are likely to have tariff changes in the next 2 to 6 weeks. And, it's keeping on top of that information. So key part of what we do is automating that process. So 50% of the time, it just happens, our tariff management system will just pick it up and change it. If there's a tariff supplier switch, we see that and we'll prompt the driver to say, looks like you changed supplier, can you confirm this? But wherever we can, we try and do it without the drivers needing to get involved. And then again, I guess because the payment is literally going from you as the employer, fleet driver, to us as MENA, to the energy supplier directly, there's no money hitting the employee, there's no risk of bill shock. everything carries on as normal. They pay for the home energy, we pay for the EV energy that's consumed at home. And I guess that's it in summary, really, and if you want a way of reimbursing actual costs, obviously I would say this, but I believe that this is one of the better solutions. And you can combine it with lots of, if you've got existing things like mileage tracking, or if you've got existing hardware, that's another sometimes challenge. We have seen people say, oh well, I've already got X box on my wall, whether that be an Omi cable or an EO box. We can pull all the data from all these different sources and just combine it into one. So that's it in a nutshell, really. Rambled through that quite quickly, trying to keep up on time. So
thanks ever so much, Ashley. That was fabulous. Our last presentation today is from Peter McDonald of Omi.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Look, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak. I'm very honoured and thankful to work with the Association of Fleet Professionals. I strongly value having a good industry representation, and from my experience in this space, fleet managers are the real champions in this transition. You've got a hugely challenging environment to work within, managing energy and vehicles in this transition. So yeah, if I can help, I'd love to. And yeah, thanks for letting me follow TMC and Mina. So I'm Peter. I've been at automotive manufacturers for the last 20 years. And most recently, I've been heavily involved with Nissan, supporting customers in EV transition. Early on, before the benefit in kind changes on cars, there were a great number of range and infrastructure related issues that prevented mass adoption of EVs. That's got a bit easier, certainly on cars. On vans, there are still a number of challenges. And I think fleet managers need to look at all of the various options available and how to best support that transition. While I was in Nissan, I purposely scouted the market and built relationships with the AFP and the BVRLA and a number of the new and existing technology and service innovators. And primarily because they offered fleets something that would help them overcome the various challenges they might have. And one of those biggest challenges was what we're talking about today, fleet management and charging data. So I don't really want to repeat the great discussion and strong points made by Paul and Ashley. We work with Mina and admire what they do, and obviously want to be collaborative. So I'm aware you're a very educated audience, and many of you are deeply involved in facing these charging challenges in your business. Evidently, to run your fleet below the 4 pence per mile AER, you need to maximize home charging. Dumb EV charging can often cost 5 to 6 pence per mile. Smart charging using agile tariffs and demand system response can make that more like 1 to 2 pence per mile. Or actually, I appreciate these are extreme moments in time, but during the first COVID lockdown, some of those time of use tariffs went negative, which obviously much cheaper again. And I know you need to work with great partners that can enable insightful data. So I'm new to Omi. I left the world of automotive last week, and I want you to find this presentation useful, and wanted to share a few points from Omi. So may I just go on to the second chart, please, James? So the big things that Omi see on the horizon for fleet managers, and I guess this incorporates energy and vehicle fleet. One is there's going to be huge volatility in the electricity grid, and this will only heighten and incentivize the optimization of when vehicles are charged, the speed at which they're charged, and the smartness of the charging solution behind them. The second one is that fleet managers have got, have got to pay for the transition. Someone's got to pay for, electric vehicles cost more, and evidently there is new infrastructure and new solutions to charge them. And those upfront transition costs are high. So fleets need to optimize their fleet purpose and utilization through effective fleet management. And that's where people like TMC really come in terms of helping support that. The third bit is early adopters of EVs were more willing to accept a complicated charging experience. If you really were one of those people who bought an early first edition Leaf, you're probably quite willing to put up with a clunky experience on charging. What we are now going into is experiencing these aren't early adopters anymore. This is the early majority, and they will be less comfortable and less compassionate towards charging solutions that are complicated and have got a lot of friction in them. Would you mind if we use the third chart, James? Thanks. So where does OMI fit in? OMI's got a variety of products that work in this space. We've got an ecosystem that covers most of the application fleet managers will be needing to use. Things like vehicle battery data. They'll want to be reducing their energy bills. They'll want to be balancing the grid, obviously, but reducing the CO2 as much as possible by charging at the right time. Often want to be bundling products, and TMC and MENA are a part of that as well, together with energy providers. And some of you may even be looking for things like park and charge solutions for your work premises. So if I just delve into one of those in a bit more detail, could I just move to the next chart, please, James? So what do OMI do? OMI have got two 7 kilowatt hardware solutions that OMI own. We own the hardware and the intellectual property behind these, and they're perfect for fleet managers. So on the left is a portable cable, and that remains with the driver or the vehicle. So if you are a fleet and you have got maybe temporary people and temporary employees, you don't want to go to the extent of fitting chargers to houses. This cable plugs into a commando socket or a 3-pin socket. There's a Schuko, so it works in Europe as well. And what it does is this portable cable is intelligent. So it can plug into an existing socket, and the cable's got 3G and GPS. So the unit knows where it is and can provide data on the charge. And it's controlled through an app. The OMI cable enables any of those charges to then become smart, and you can track the data, which then can feed into systems like MENA and TMC. The item on the right is a new product, it's a home charger that offers similar functionality. So apart from this portable cable, this is something which would sit in your house in much the same way a Pod Point or a Charge Master would, but it includes a much better data quality. So I'll move to the next chart. Thanks, James. So for both of these, the driver downloads the app, selects the vehicle they drive. So you go through the system, it identifies you identify which vehicle you've got and which tariff you've got. And then you select how you want the car to be charged at what time of the day. So effectively, you will say something like, I want my vehicle to be charged by 80% by 8 a.m. in the morning, and you hand over control of the charging of that to the grid. What it therefore does is it charges at the time of the day with the lowest cost of use. The vehicle charger optimizes that for you. But since it's got the 3G, 4G, and GPS data incorporated, it includes a hell of a lot more detail about the cost and the data around that charge. And the app allows the driver to control that charging experience. This software enables a rich data feed into the fleet management platform that OMI operate. This allows fleet managers to identify and track separate drivers. It can look at their energy consumption by source. It can differentiate between home, work, and public charging, so it can split the bill. Just as an aside, OMI have a relationship with FleetCore. So if you use the All-Star Fuel Card, you can take the OMI energy data and utilize it on their platform. So if you use the All-Star Fuel Card in one place, you can see the cost of your petrol diesel, and you can see the cost of your electric vehicles in one spot. Evidently, I'd be saying this, it's better to use the OMI hardware where possible, but we can integrate with other hardware providers. Just referring to something that Ashley talked about, we have a similar experience to MENA that some hardware is easy to access than others in terms of the data quality. We work with anything with an OCPP protocol, and we can integrate with them. And then from a public charging perspective, there are something like 30 to 40 public networks, and there are 4 major aggregators in those. We take data from these major aggregators like All-Star and ZapPay, and we're in discussion with Electric Juice and Bonnet, which would allow us to collect the data of the cost and energy consumption when you're out using public charging. If you would mind, move on to the next slide, please, James. So through the fleet management portal, the platform asks the driver information and their bank account details. the driver and fleet manager both know the costs related to their charging, and the driver can be reimbursed directly from the platform. So OMI's got a direct relationship with many of those major energy companies like Octopus, and we can bill them directly, or OMI can pay the driver and we give one invoice back to the fleet manager. So I guess just in summary, we work with MENA. So as they take hardware solutions from a variety of different sources, whether it be PodPoint, ChargeMaster, they also take an OMI data feed, so it can feed into everything they've talked about. Yeah, we think they do great work. And I just wanted to take a small opportunity to share an overview of the functionality that we currently have available. And I hope it stimulates some debate on what's possible and why Fleet could be considering these sorts of options from all the suppliers you've heard from today. So thank you very much, James. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's great. I'd now like to start the Q&A session. We've had a number of questions through already. First one to you, Paul, if I may.
Yep.
If we were to use TMC's AFRs that are higher than the HMRC rates,
yep,
would there be any tax liability to the driver?
Okay, so to answer that, the rules, going back to the rules from revenue, are that you can either pay the employee at AER or at actual cost. If you can demonstrate to the revenue that what you are reimbursing the employee is relatively actual cost, then the revenue are going to be fine with the reimbursement methods. So to answer the question is, I would suggest that you always involve your FC and FD just to make sure that they are comfortable with it, but it is a good option. And I used to be an FD and FC, and I would use that method myself rather than going into any actual cost type of calculations. But it just needs to be approved, and you guys internally need to be happy with it as well, because the other option is you do deep dive and you collect all of the home charge point data, you collect all the EV highway data, you collect all of the office data, and then reimburse based on the cost per kilowatt hour and the split between business and private. So I think it's a good halfway house solution, to be honest. And we do have a lot of our customers that have been signed off internally by them that are happy to use that method.
Thank you, Paul. Got a question here for you, Peter, from Fiona. She's concerned that, what if there's 2 EVs on the household? How does it work then?
Yeah, I think a good question. And I think over time, lots of households are going to have more than one EV and more than one battery electric vehicle. It's evident that a lot of households will have 2 EVs. So what the OMI app does is it's got an API integration to the 8 largest vehicle OEMs. So it means we communicate direct to the vehicle, and the OMI user is able to manually choose which vehicle they choose to charge on the OMI app. So you're just choosing between 2 different vehicles. Evidently, you could also set up 2 different OMI apps. One, if one's your partner's car and one's yours, you use a different app interface. So yeah, either of those options are available.
Okay. Another question: do we think HMRC will change the AER rates?
So,
Paul, do you want to run with that one?
I'm going to take my TMC hat off and put my AFP hat on. So we as the AFP, we have had, with the Beaver LA, we've been working in partnership with the Beaver LA, so the whole industry trying to come together to try and sort this issue out. We went to HMRC to say a few things. One is that we believe that 4P isn't sufficient in all cases. The next thing was that that we would like a mechanism for the review of AER on a regular basis. And it doesn't actually need to be quarterly, but it does need to be, we do need to have a mechanism, because HMRC have not reviewed AER since 2018. And as I've shown on my charts, although the cost per kilowatt hour, according to the Office of National Statistics, admittedly this was a few months ago, is always floated around 16 pence per kilowatt hour. It's now moved to 17 pence, and it'll probably move again based on what Ash has said as well. I completely agree that we're heading in one direction at the moment in terms of average cost per kilowatt hour at the moment for home energy, but it hasn't really changed. But the vehicles have significantly, as you see on my charts. So we also have asked for a hydrogen rate, believe it or not. And we've also asked for a view about what to do around vans if they're charging at home as well, because they're different to cars. We've had a session with HMRC, and although I was expecting it to be a long drawn out affair, it finished 15 minutes earlier than expected, and we were pushing at an open door. They agreed with all of our points between the AFP and the BVRLA, and they are currently reviewing AER ASAP. So as a top priority. Now, what I would say is, it is public sector, there's probably a lot of things within their organisation they need to iron out. So it's not going to be an easy fix, but they are looking at reviewing AER ASAP. So we're hoping that before Christmas, we're going to have some news about what their proposals are, and hopefully we will start to see something change in the marketplace on AER. But what that looks like, we don't, as the AFP, we don't really know at the moment.
Okay. All right, thanks, Paul. We have a question from Barry. What is the panel's view on recent press articles around the government's imposed restrictions on switching off charge points when demand cannot be met for general energy supply? Who would like to take that one first?
Great question. Not me.
Don't mind giving a bit of insight. Yeah, I don't mind giving a bit of insight into that. I think this concept of turning EV charging off, we're not talking for hours. We could be talking for literally, in some cases, 2 minutes, or turning things down. So this is not the government taking control and you waking up to an empty battery. But there's also this concept of, right, when your entire street is full of EV chargers on everyone's drives, it may not be a matter of just turning off charging. It could just be a question of just slowly turning them on, so that not everybody. And this is kind of where smart charging can sometimes fall over, because if everything is controlled by a single smart charge device that suddenly triggers at a specific second, everything is coming on at that moment. In the current world, we don't come home and all turn our kettle on at exactly the same time. But if technology controls that, our cars will charge all at the same time. So we need to use that technology to slowly turn things on, and literally turn things on off for potentially 30 seconds. There's not an immense, demand, or such an immense demand that the lights are going to go out. That's
okay.
fine.
That's your view. Has anybody else got a view?
Yeah, thank you. Julie, if you wouldn't mind. Ironically, I was at the BVRLA function yesterday and spoke to the Sunday Times journalist that shared the article over the weekend. So it is written in the documentation, he tells me. If you go into huge amounts of detail, it is written there. I think what will end up happening is practically there'll be workarounds. So it doesn't mean you can't override. It might turn off, but it doesn't mean you can't override it. At the very least, it could even stimulate people using commando cables, because the grid would have no idea that that's a charger versus something that's powering a fridge, for instance. So it could stimulate a different way to get your charging infrastructure. But I guess in my view, Julie, it stimulates a debate about what's smart. So when you've got this volatile supply and demand of electricity, I believe Bill Gates's book talks about how solar arrays have to be built on the basis of only working at 30% capacity, because there are days when it's not sunny. And if you're going to power a town off the solar grid, you need to work even when it needs to work, even when there's not a huge amount of sun, which does mean when there is lots of sun, there's going to be a huge amount of capacity that comes into the grid. And this is going to be really volatile as renewables have sun or wind, and they do or don't generate something. So what the grid really needs is devices that can turn off. And at the moment, it can't turn off a fridge. It can't turn off your light. It wouldn't know if you're a hospital or a house. It can't turn things off. And what they really want is, when renewables are down, rather than turn on a fossil fuel power plant, what they want to be able to do is go, what can I find some devices to turn off? So I think it's going to stimulate what does smart mean. And if I just give the Ohmie example, the Ohmie charger is smart from the basis that it says you want to be 80% charged by 8 a.m. in the morning, but doesn't stipulate exactly when that vehicle is going to get charged. So they are devices that can be turned off. as long as they get to that charge at that moment in time. So I think this will stimulate a big debate about what smart charging really means, and what personal drivers, fleets, and government want to be, I guess, advocating in this space.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. We have another question. What have you found to be the preferred home charging reimbursement model? Direct to energy provider or to the employee stroke fleet driver? Paul?
So I think what myself, Ash and Peter have presented is there are options. There are a lot of options, and I know for fleet operators it's quite difficult to navigate this topic. Who do you speak to? Do you speak to somebody like TMC? Do you speak to a tech startup like Ash? Do you speak to your charge point operator? Do you speak to your lease code? Do you speak to your fuel card provider? And the reason we're doing this webinar is because we know it's complicated and options. So, but not trying to dodge a question and say there are options. What I'm seeing anyway is on cars, because there's a split between business and private, and the magnitude of the money to be reimbursed is smaller, that tends to be done through a TMC expense type system for cars, particularly perk cars. Where me and Ash spend a lot of our time is on the vans, in particular, where they're doing an awful lot of business miles. They ideally, you don't want your van driver needing to faff around doing expense claim forms for everything as well. And you also don't want them to worry about issues with their energy bills because they're taking the money up front. And Ash's solution as well is really cool because, of course, that money is being reimbursed directly into the energy provider rather than the employees. The employees then not spending all the money and then realizing at Christmas that they've got a massive bill for energy and they can't afford to pay it. So what I would say is it really depends on, and this is a segmentation, cars per can need one way, vans another way. Those with driveways or not, two separate populations to deal with again. And then obviously then think about personal use, and that's where TMC comes in as well, with personal use on cars, personal use on vans, and that's where me and Ash are spending all of our time, particularly on the vans. But to be fair with Ash as well, we're spending time on cars as well. So it really depends on the customer and what they want to do and how they want to manage their employee base. Yeah, but I'll let Ash and Peter also answer on this.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you on that, Paul. I think it depends on segmenting the driver, as you've said. I think sometimes we speak to fleet managers who have a preferred method that they want to maybe push through, but often sometimes the driver has a different preference. And I think one of the keys in EV transition that we've learned is you've got to get the drivers on side, because if you have if you had bad PR within an organization around EVs, it's a lot harder to transition versus, I've had an EV, it's absolutely great, you should definitely get one. The transition is going to be a lot easier that way. So just as Paul says, really, you've got to segment the drivers, listen to what they want and figure out. You might have two methods. You might have, one for a particular type of driver and another method for another type of driver.
Yeah, I think it depends as well on the bill size, how much is going to be reimbursed. If it's hundreds of pounds every month of energy that needs to be reimbursed, then it's a different magnitude than if it's £40. Yeah. So I think, again, it's going to that whole chestnut of data. I think, again, fleet needs to understand the data, the likely cost burn, all that type of stuff, and develop strategies, and sitting down with people like me, Ashley, Peter, the rest of their supply chain to work out how they want to navigate this topic, because it is challenging and it's difficult to work out. I think if I was a fleet operator, whether to turn left or right.
Yeah. Peter, have you got a comment on this?
Yes, but I don't have a huge amount. I violently agree with what Paul and Ashley have said. So yeah, we found that it differs based on the customer base. So we just decided, from our perspective, we offered to build flexibility of either system. But yeah, we haven't found a particular preference yet.
Yeah. I think as well, just adding that what all three of us have tried to do as well is to find work on simplicity for the employee. You know, that's the most, and going back to Ashley's point, if we can make it simple and slick and easy a process for the employee, then that's fundamentally important. And I think OMI, MENA and TMC all work on those sort of principles.
Okay, great. Interesting question here. Should fleet managers be thinking about getting employees to change their energy supplier to one with a cheaper smart tariff like Octopus? Or would you like to pick that up first?
Oh wow, it's a moral dilemma, isn't it? So I am on Octopus. I love Octopus. I've been on Octopus since my first EV 7-8 years ago. There are other brands available, but I do think when you're driving an EV, I think it's sensible for the employee to think about managing their overall cost base. But of course, what you don't want to do is take a flexible solution and then your heating bills go up and your water and everything else just because you're trying to run your car a bit cheaper. So again, I think as fleet managers, we should try and educate our drivers about options that they can select to be able to minimize their costs and help support them with their EV home solutions. But I don't think ever that you could force anybody or twist their arm or anything like that. It's entirely up to them when it comes down to it. I don't know what Ashley or Peter think.
Yeah, well, I think I agree with you, Paul. We've been asked sometimes the straight up question, oh, can we just get all our drivers to switch to this tariff? And that sounds like an easy ask, but you know, one, you just can't force anybody to change tariff. You know, it's like saying to them, we'd like you to all be with EE for your mobile phones, even though it's not even though we're not paying the bill. You just can't do that. You know, and while these overnight tariffs like Octopus and obviously our others are cheaper to charge EV, they can make the home more expensive, you know, which is obviously not great for the driver who's maybe then paying higher for the home. One of the things we've been looking at and working with a particular energy supplier on is just how can we just have a lower overall tariff? Because, you know, even if it's 1 pence a kilowatt cheaper than what they're currently on, that's still better for the fleet than having it as low as 5p. But it's a very sensitive area. Obviously, you know, the worst case scenario is fleet manager, fleet operator says, right, you've all got to switch to this tariff, or please switch to this tariff. You know, 2 months later, it could be cheaper at the time. 2 months later, it could go up. You know, it's sensitive area, I would say, on the home.
Yeah. Okay.
Julie, I agree with what Paul and Ashley have said. Evidently, there are broader considerations, and there may be some cost involved today. But what I guess I would draw to is the future, that we've seen energy wholesale prices go up. The margins the energy companies are making is much tighter. Wholesale market for energy everywhere's gone up, every source of energy. Then as they introduce renewables, they are going to have volatility in their supply. They are going to struggle to have standard rates that are competitive. They're likely to go up. So it's likely to build a bigger gap between what a standard rate is and a time of use tariff is. So I would argue that differential gets bigger over time, bigger. And what the energy companies really, really need is flexibility. They need the ability to turn some things off. Otherwise, they need, there's a peak in demand. You need to turn a fossil fuel power plant on. They can turn them on. I'm told, I'm not the expert in this field, but I'm told they turn them on in 5 or 10 minutes. But that's bad for the environment, bad for cost and all sorts of things. They want some things they can turn off. So that's where smart charging provision is going to be really interesting and important in this field, and probably build a stronger case over time, as there is a bigger gap between what you can get if you are really optimizing your charge versus what you get as a standard rate.
Yeah. Interestingly, we've got a question about the future of energy costs. What's the panel's view of what's going to be happening over the next few years? Who'd like to pick that one up?
It's a difficult one to answer. I think they'll go up. They'll probably come down in the short term, maybe at home. But I think on the public side, they will go up. And I've said, this is just my personal view. there are certain charge points that I think I would pay 50 pence a kilowatt to charge at, and they're 20 pence a kilowatt. And you think, why are they so cheap? Especially in today's world. Personal view is I just can't see anything going down in the electricity world.
No,
There's no science to back that up, by the way.
that's your view.
My
Yes.
view.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I would agree with Ashley. I can't see them going down anytime soon. I think where you've got energy providers going bust, they're being regulated, so they can only charge a maximum cap. If they can't afford to run at those cap levels, then just pure economics would dictate that effectively some are running at a loss and some are running at just marginal profit, so they need to increase their margins to be able to operate. So I can't see that not ever going down, but you never know. It just depends on overall production and supply. And then the EV highway, I think there's such a disproportionate cost depending on the provider that, again, my business at TMC will undoubtedly transform from managing people filling up at really expensive filling stations and motorway fills to managing employees when they're charging up at really expensive charge stations and they need to be going to somewhere more economical. So that will all start to change as well in the medium term as there's more and more charge points, there's more and more EVs, there's more and more competition in the marketplace. So I think that's going to be quite interesting about what ends up being the average cost of energy from a charge point provider across the entire market. And I'm sure that data will start to come out by somebody like Zap Maps or something at some point in time. Maybe they already do it, but it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah. Okay, I'm mindful of time, so we'll just go for one final question. What happen? What do we do about employees without driveways? I know you've mentioned that, Paul, but what would you recommend for this population?
It's still a tough topic. We as the AFP have, starting on the EV committee, starting to tackle this topic a little bit more aggressively in terms of curbside charging. Again, going back to the segmentation, cars and vans. Cars is less of a problem, I think, because I don't know about everybody else on this webinar, but I only probably charge my car maybe 2.5 times a week. And that's manageable, I think, from an EV highway perspective, if you're sensible and you're working in an office and you've got office-based charging and things like that. Vans is a whole different type of problem. So again, it's working with if a driver wants an EV and they don't have a driveway, we should be supportive as fleet operators and try and get them working. Yeah. But we just need to make sure that we do the diligence with them to make it sustainable, and they've realized and they understand where they can charge up, how they can charge up, and work with each employee about their particular needs. But unfortunately, because there's no national infrastructure really in place for this, you need to work on an employee by employee, driver by driver basis to make sure that they can get it to work and it's all sensible, because different locations have completely different infrastructure at the moment.
So very time consuming for the fleet manager to have to go through that process, unfortunately.
Totally. But it's part of our new job.
Yeah.
Add it to the list of all the other billion things that we're doing.
We've got to do. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you ever so much, guys. It's been a really useful session. Great questions. Thank you for those that have sent those through. As mentioned previously, we'll be including the webinar recording into the AFP website for future member reference. Please do have a browse through the website. We've recently updated it, and there's lots of great information there, including the benefits of AFP membership. So we'd encourage you to look at that and to join up as soon as possible. These webinars will not be open as they are today moving forward. So if you found this of interest, please join and to make sure that you're included in future webinars and future events. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Paul, Ashley and Peter, of course, for their contribution today, and hope you found the webinar as interesting as I did. Just a couple of plugs, if I may. Our next webinar is to be held on the Wednesday, the 13th of October, starting at 9:30, when we're going to be looking at the mobility journey. So look forward to your involvement in that. And before closing, I'd like to just bring your attention to a couple of one-day training courses we've planned. The 13th of October, we've got an EV training course, and the 20th of October, we've got an ELCV training course. So please go to the website to enroll. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you all once again for your time this morning, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.